Have you ever been right about to buy or search for something on your phone and then the app just crashes? It's the worst. Not only does it make us mad, but even a short outage can have a real impact on businesses and could change how people spend their money. We're joined by Unnati Narang, an assistant professor of business administration at Gies College of Business. Unnati, you and your co-authors looked at this very topic. You took a deep dive into a large, familiar retailer, one with both physical stores and a growing online presence, and you were able to capture data from an app failure that lasted 2 hours. Nearly half the shoppers who tried to log into the app that day were affected by this outage, and you looked at their shopping outcomes over the next 14 days. A really interesting study. Tell me more about how this idea came about.
Thanks, Aaron. I'm very excited to talk about this research. And like you said, I am through and through a retail person. So when I looked at this setting of how app failures could affect how people purchase, even in stores and not just online, I was very excited at what this project could turn into. To give you some background, before I joined my PhD, for several years I was working in retail as the co-founder of a musical instrument startup back in my hometown in New Delhi. And even back in 2011-12, when I noticed shoppers coming into the store, they had already done their research online. So that got me thinking when I finally joined my PhD program and got involved with Center for Retailing Studies. It got me thinking, was there a way I could continue studying these questions even as part of my research? And I met Venki Shankar there, who was heading the Center for Retailing Studies at that time at Texas A&M University. And together, we started collaborating with a large US retailer of consumer electronics with over 4,000 stores and a growing online presence. We also brought in another collaborator, Sridhar Narayanan from Stanford, who is also an expert in digital strategy and causal questions. So the initial idea for this study, if I really think back to it, came from a serendipitous discovery. As a grad student, I was working with the mobile app usage data, getting excited about the potential to learn and uncover new insights. And I remember this very clear visual, this graph I had plotted that had huge spikes. So there were certain days on which the mobile app had huge extent of server errors or failures, which we later discovered by talking to the retailer were app outages beyond their control. And what was interesting to me, again, coming from a retail background, was that the company was seeing this as an IT issue rather than a marketing issue. But I immediately connected this with the huge body of research in marketing on service failures that I had in parallel been discussing with, faculty like Len Berry, who is the pioneer, the founding person behind the field of services marketing really at Texas A&M. So I knew that prior to our studies, service failures in marketing had mostly been looked at through surveys, through qualitative data, but there was not much done quantitatively to causally quantify the extent of losses that could come from these types of failures. And here was a chance to better understand with granular individual level shopper data, how would an app failure affect them, not only in terms of how they engage with the app subsequently, but also in their actual behavior when they go on to make a purchase, or if they don't go on to make a purchase in stores or online.
App failures can be devastating for a business, and the data can be really hard to get because app failures are unpredictable. Tell me a little bit more about that process and what you ultimately found.
To give you some appreciation for how hard it is to answer this question, this isn't a setting where you could run a field experiment or do A/B testing like Amazon's and Netflix's of the world would do, because no retailer in their sane mind would induce app failures in their own app, even for a subset of shoppers, as it could really damage their experience and long-term loyalty as well. So we wouldn't be able to run a field experiment, and that's why we explored this kind of clever setting, which social scientists and economists call a natural experiment. And our key findings really did show that after the app failure, over a period of 2 weeks, we see a decline in the frequency, quantity, and value of purchases that these shoppers make between 3 to 7%.
Importantly here, both groups of people spent more money after the crash. However, those who experienced the crash spent less money than those who had no problem with the app. There was a 3.2% decline in the frequency, a 3.8% decline in the quantity, and a 7% decline in the monetary value of purchases. So customers didn't shop as often, they didn't buy as many items, and didn't spend as much money. In this case, this was as much as $1 million in short-term revenue losses and an additional $1.89 million in potential long-term revenue erosion. These are potentially lost customers or those who just permanently decide to spend less money there. Now, that decrease wasn't distributed equally across online and in-store purchases. You found actually the in-store purchases took the biggest hit.
Yeah, exactly. And that was a key surprising finding for us as researchers to see that there's a decrease happening after a failure is experienced in a mobile app, which you could argue is a digital channel or a digital way of interacting with consumers. We see a decrease happening in offline in-store purchases of these shoppers rather than their online spending. So we really did want to understand more about the cross-channel implications of these types of app failures.
So the question here is, why are we seeing a bigger drop in in-store purchases after an app crash? And you think it's all about how people use shopping apps. And you discovered a few possible reasons, whether you're browsing or buying. So you split customers up into two groups. You call them search users and checkout users. Tell me about this.
So we really wanted to understand why in-store spending decreases, because that was a bit of a puzzling result, something we didn't expect going in, and there was no change in online spending. We decided to consider multiple potential competing explanations for what may be causing this kind of effect of app failures. And to put it simply, think of yourself as the shopper. What are some options you have when you experience an outage? Say you're about to use the app and it crashes. You could either delay your action, maybe come back to it later. You could abandon that action altogether, or you could think about potentially switching channel. Instead of going to the app, you could go to the website. So we took this idea intuitively, how would shoppers behave or react when an app failure affects them? And so our first possibility was, what if they just discontinued whatever action they were taking? And part of this explanation is the search discontinuation, where if shoppers mainly use the app to search, but they are buying mostly or majority of their purchases are happening in the store, then they may abandon their shopping journey altogether once the app fails. And without access to the information provided by the app about products, about deals, perhaps this search discontinuation would then lead to these decreased purchases or foregoing the purchase altogether, which is an explanation we find for why there's a decrease in offline purchases in stores. Now, if you think about the other explanation, which is they could also switch channels quite easily, particularly going from the app to a desktop or maybe to a mobile browser and buy online or complete their search online even. So what this would mean is that shoppers who are used to the online channel should be able to find that channel switching much more appealing, much more natural to them. And so we test this explanation as well, which helps us explain why the online purchases don't get as much of a hit when the app fails. And finally, in the paper, we also consider temporal delays, maybe just coming back to the app later, but we don't see much evidence. So really, the strongest evidence we find for why in-store purchases decrease is about search discontinuation, which is a key driver of this kind of a revenue loss. And back to your point, we do split the users into search and checkout users because we have the advantage of huge amounts of historical data on their app usage behavior. So we took their entire patterns of using the app for the last 1 year and classify them as predominantly search users if they use the app for looking for products, deals, store information, but never make a purchase through the app. Or they could be checkout users if they also use the app to make a purchase. And we find that these effects are significantly more negative and more significant for the search users. And again, you may say, well, at the time of the failure, perhaps they were not using the app to search. How do you tease that apart? So we also look at the exact moment right before the failure occurrence happens. And, there's no way for customers to anticipate these And we again find that those who were on the search-related pages experience a negative effect on their purchases in stores rather than those who were trying to make a purchase because they go ahead and make their purchase in other channels.
Yeah, so search users are the people who just kind of stroll through, they're checking things out, but not actively buying anything. They're using the app for information and discovery. The checkout users are the ones who actually buy stuff within the app. And the vast majority of people you looked at were search users, treating the app as their starting point for shopping. And it was these search users who are responsible for that big drop in spending.
Exactly. For search users, like you said, the app was a critical part of their search experience, their shopping journey. They're still kind of early in their shopping journey, and many of them just decide to forego the purchase or don't go to the store at all. And within search, we also looked at, further classifications. Were these search users those who are very typically also going on the website and buying versus only buying in stores? And again, we find a bigger effect if they were buying in stores, then they're likely to forego their purchases much more.
So when the app crashed, their shopping journey was interrupted right at the beginning. The app was their main source of information, and when it failed, they were less likely to then go to the store. So what about these checkout users, the ones who are ready to buy?
So we initially going in thought that checkout users would be affected the most because for them, app is their go-to channel for actually making a purchase. And if the app is not there, or there's an unavailability for several hours, they may not return to the app or they may completely forego their purchase. But this is not what we find in the data. And the reason we don't find a decrease for checkout users is because they're the ones who are easily able to pivot to the retailer's website. So channel switching could be much stronger for them when they're unable to purchase through the app. And this tells us that the way people use the app is very important for how they will react when there is an outage.
Okay, so for the search users who mostly shopped in stores before, their purchases dropped off. So it seems like the app crashing threw off their whole shopping plan. If they weren't already in buying mode, that app failure was enough to deter them completely.
Search users are using the app primarily to look for product information, sometimes even product availability real time in stores. They're also deal hunting, maybe looking for discounts or product bundles, and then also for store information near them. But when the app failed, the shoppers who mainly used to search for products and deals are the ones that are the hardest to hit. And we see this converging evidence even when we look at what happens to discounted purchases. So these are purchases that were offered some kind of deals. And those are the ones that are most affected for these types of search users because now they're unable to find deals or specific products in stores that they may have been looking for to begin with. And so it wasn't just about general browsing. When we say search, we mean more, actions that shoppers would take before they're making a purchase. So this is very deliberate. They're thinking about key information that could influence their decision to buy. And any app failure would disrupt this kind of pre-shopping search that they were doing. And unlike checkout users who may simply switch to web or switch to other channels, these search users are the ones who are predominantly already using the store for most of their purchases. And so they decide to completely forego that purchase.
And it makes you wonder what all this means for customer loyalty if an app is unreliable. And you looked into whether different types of shoppers reacted differently to the app crashes. What did you find there?
Yeah, so again, let me explain our thinking behind this. Not all shoppers are built the same way. Not everybody is going to be impacted by app failures. Some people are much more forgiving. They might just overlook and may not be bothered by it. But then there could be some others who really value that maybe, experience of using the app and they wanted to make it more convenient for them. That's their expectation. And when that expectation is not met, they may not be so tolerant of a failure. And it's important for retailers to understand how the app failure affects different shoppers differently to really figure out who do we target even? Whose experience do we try to manage? And so what we found when it comes to loyalty is that high spending shoppers were actually less affected. So you could argue that they're relatively more loyal. And it is possible that they are more forgiving of the retailer because they like the retailer so much to begin with. And we also found that those shoppers who had made a more recent purchase, they were actually more sensitive to the disruption, which suggests that maybe their expectation from a very recent purchase experience which went smoothly or a search experience which went smoothly, maybe they were having even higher expectations from the retailer. So again, we can't tease these explanations apart fully for these subgroups given our data, but it's really important for retailers to figure out what types of shoppers are more affected versus not.
Yeah, there's a lot of really good information within this paper. What do you think is the big takeaway here for retailers?
Mobile app and mobile app reliability, it's not just an IT issue. It directly impacts their revenues, their bottom line. When an app fails, it disrupts shoppers' journey, particularly as our paper shows, it disrupts what they search for, if they're able to search or not, and it can lead to lost sales even in stores. So retailers should try to mitigate this by proactively monitoring their app performance, seeing it as part of their core omni-channel strategy, communicating about it transparently. And retailers really need to think about how these mobile apps can serve as an essential part. And often it's the very first interface, very first touch point in a shopper's journey, and not just as a digital tool. And as much as possible, personalizing that experience would also go a long way.
It's pretty clear that the line is getting more blurred than ever between the digital and physical shopping worlds. And even a single app failure can actually have a ripple effect on how we shop, where we shop, and how much we spend. That was Unnati Narang, Assistant Professor of Business Administration at Gies College of Business. The paper is called Cross-Channel Effects of Failure in a Retailer's Mobile App, and it was published in the Journal of Marketing Research. You can read more about this and other research from the college at giesbusiness.illinois.edu.